The mid-30s marked a real turning point in military aviation. The old biplanes, which formed the backbone of air fleets back then, had reached the limit of their capabilities. So designers in different countries started developing more promising and high-speed monoplanes. In September 1935, the prototype MS-405 took to the skies in France for the first time. Just a month later, the famous Bf-109 took off in Germany. Great Britain wasn't lagging behind either. In October 1935, the Hawker Hurricane went up, and in March 1936, the legendary Spitfire followed it. Thus, the Royal Air Force received two magnificent aircraft. But for naval aviation, things were going much worse. On aircraft carrier decks, there was a sharp shortage of modern equipment. It got to the point where the role of fighters for fleet defense was being performed by dive bombers, the Blackburn Skua. It would seem the simplest solution was to take a successful land-based fighter and adapt it for the sea. But that idea wasn't even considered. The British Admiralty stood firm on its position. A carrier-based aircraft absolutely had to be a two-seater. The military believed that a second crew member, a navigator radio operator, was vitally necessary to maintain contact with the ship. He was also needed to help the pilot find the aircraft carrier in bad weather. However, this requirement inevitably led to an increase in the size and weight of the machine. Because of this, bulky carrier-based aircraft lost out significantly to their lighter land-based competitors. The Fleet Air Arm leadership, impressed by the superb characteristics and powerful armament of the Hurricane and Spitfire fighters, ordered a new prototype from Fairey Aviation. The chief designer, a Belgian named Marcel Lobel, took a non-standard approach. He decided to modify the existing prototypes of the Fairey Battle bomber to meet these requirements. These planes had been flying since April 1937. Lobel lightened the structure and added everything necessary for carrier-based aviation: an arrestor hook, catapult mounts, a wing folding mechanism, and survival gear, including an inflatable dinghy. In each wing, they installed a battery of 4 Browning machine guns, .30 caliber. They equipped the new machine with a Merlin RM-3M motor. This was a modification of the Merlin II engine with a supercharger that maintained maximum power up to an altitude of 7,500 feet. Work on the design dragged on, and at times even came to a halt because Marcel Lobel was tied up designing the Albacore and Barracuda aircraft. Because of this, the plane, which by that time had received the name Fulmar, was ready only in early 1940. It took to the skies for the first time from Ringway Airfield near Manchester on April 4, 1940, with the company's chief pilot, Duncan Menzies, at the controls. The new fighter had an incredibly attractive silhouette. Factory trials showed excellent handling, especially at low speeds and a long flight duration. However, some fears were confirmed. The maximum speed was insufficient, and the rate of climb left a lot to be desired. Right on the heels of the first Fulmar, on April 6, 1940, the second prototype went up. This one was already equipped with a Merlin 8 engine with a takeoff power of 1080 horsepower. Both aircraft went through official testing at the Experimental Aviation and Armament Center at Boscombe Down. In early April, the third example flew over to the Naval Aviation Test Unit, specifically to 778 Squadron in the town of Lee-on-Solent. There was a plan to put the next 2 Fulmars on floats. However, the engineers eventually realized this would significantly drag down the already not-so-high speed, so they finished them up as standard land-based aircraft. Serial production of the Fulmar Mark I model kicked off that same April 1940. In May, they rolled out 6 machines, in June 12, in July 20, and by August they had assembled 25 aircraft. All in all, the factory in Stockport built 250 units of the Mark I version powered by the Merlin 8 engine. Toward the end of 1940, they installed a much more powerful Merlin 30 engine on the 155th serial aircraft, which was cranking out 1,300 horsepower. This airframe became the prototype for the Mark II version and went through testing in April 1941. Aside from the new motor, it stood out with a slightly more bulging radiator fairing and had 2 separate carburetor intakes on the sides. That is exactly how all subsequent Fulmar Mark IIs looked, even though airframes of the previous modification were still coming off the assembly line at that moment. Thanks to its design, the Fulmar aircraft was a perfect fit for installing radars. They borrowed one airborne interception Mark VI radar station from the Royal Air Force and installed it on a Fulmar Mark II at the test center in Lee-on-Solent, placing the system's antennas under the outer parts of the wings. In early 1943, they tested the newer centimetric airborne interception Mark 10 radar on one of the planes, placing it in separate pods under the wings. About 100 machines were converted into this modification under the designated index NF Mark II, with half of them used for training pilots. Back in the summer of 1941, the Fulmar Mark II received beefed-up weaponry, 450 caliber Browning machine guns with an ammo load of 370 rounds per barrel. All in all, there were 350 units of the Mark II model built, mainly because that increase in power didn't deliver the expected jump in performance characteristics. The top speed at optimal altitude only went up by 7 miles per hour, topping out at 263 miles per hour. The rate of climb at sea level was 1,535 feet per minute, and the maximum range, while flying at a higher cruising speed of 194 miles per hour, actually dropped to 775 miles. In February 1943, production of the Fulmar Mark I and Mark II finally wrapped up, reaching a total of 600 aircraft built. Naval aviators really loved the Fairey Fulmar for its pleasant and easy handling. Despite the long nose section, the forward view remained excellent. The pilot sat right near the leading edge of the wing, which provided particularly good visibility looking down. But what people loved most about this plane was how forgiving it was of pilot errors during landing. The machine was incredibly tough, so even an unskilled pilot could slam it onto the deck without wrecking the airframe. Naval aviation instructors training rookies on the aircraft carrier Argus absolutely adored this aircraft. The thing is, back then, there were no training machines with dual controls, so the training happened in 3 stages. First, the rookie would watch experienced pilots land from the deck. Then, he would watch the process from the navigator's seat. And finally, the third phase, the solo landing. At this point, the instructor was sitting in the back, in the navigator's spot, and the only help he could offer was shouting commands over the radio. The Argus itself was originally laid down as a passenger liner, which was later converted into a military aircraft carrier with a full-length flight deck. The smokestacks were routed to the aft section of the ship, and that created a serious problem. The smoke created an artificial updraft of hot air right at the spot where the plane had to come in for a landing. This made an already tense moment even harder. On top of that, the 5 arresting wires didn't have a self-centering system. If a pilot hooked one off-center, the wire wouldn't pull the plane back to the center line of the deck. As British pilots recall, if the plane landed a bit off-center, the wires barely kept it from tumbling into the sea. There was one incident where a trainee pilot landed way too close to the port side. The Fulmar snagged the wire, but it slowly slid right off the deck. Unbelievably, the wire didn't snap, and the hook didn't let go. The plane just hung there vertically along the side of the ship. The crew was hurriedly hauled up using a safety net. But the most amazing part is that the Fulmar was eventually put back into service with almost no damage, which is definitely more than you could say for the pilot's nervous systems. The Admiralty was in a real hurry to get these new fighters into service. The first 15 planes were handed over to 806 Squadron in June 1940. Its pilots went through a short training course at the Eastleigh base, and then loaded onto the brand new aircraft carrier Illustrious. By August 22nd, they had already set sail from Scapa Flow, heading for the eastern Mediterranean. By the way, these crews had previously flown Squad dive bombers. Right after them, 808 Squadron received 12 machines. It was formed at Worthy Down, and throughout the summer of 1940, it operated out of the Wick airfield, providing air cover for shipping in northern Scotland. Since the enemy didn't fly that far from the mainland, the pilots were extremely enthusiastic about the news of their transfer. In October, the squadron was moved to the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, which was also heading for the Mediterranean. By the end of the year, 807 Squadron had been formed. 3 of its Fulmar fighters underwent trials on the ship Pegasus. They were testing the feasibility of launching planes using a catapult from ordinary ships. The following year, 1941, saw 5 more squadrons switch to Fulmars, and in 1942 they were joined by pilots from another 6 naval aviation units. So, the new Fulmars entered combat less than 8 months after the prototype's first flight. They successfully stood up to the Italian Air Force, stopping them from attacking the naval convoys heading to Malta. The arrival of these new fighters turned out to be right on time and brought the fleet some much-needed success. Between September 2nd and October 14th, the pilots of 806 Squadron claimed 10 Italian aircraft destroyed. Most of the time, they found themselves tangling with the Italian Savoia Marchetti SM-79 torpedo bombers. In November, 808 Squadron from the carrier Ark Royal also joined the action. These aviators scored their first victory during a strike on targets over the island of Sardinia. The Fulmar Mark I fighters of 806 Squadron, sporting the number 6 on their sides and based on the carrier Illustrious, took part in the legendary raid on the Italian fleet in Taranto harbor in November 1940. This operation, codenamed Judgment, had been planned well in advance. A force commanded by Admiral Andrew Cunningham slipped out of Alexandria on November 6th to escort convoys into the Aegean Sea and to Malta. But the situation changed on November 10th when a Maryland reconnaissance plane spotted enemy ships anchored at Taranto. 24 hours later, a strike group split off from the main British force, the carrier Illustrious and the cruisers York and Gloucester. 2 reconnaissance Fulmars lifted off the carrier's deck. Once they confirmed that there were still 6 battleships, 14 cruisers, and 27 destroyers in the harbor, the first attack wave launched at 8:40 p.m. This consisted of 10 Swordfish aircraft armed with torpedoes and bombs. 2 escorting Fulmars were tasked with protecting them on the way to the target, and most importantly, lighting up the enemy ships before the strike. The Swordfish attacked from different directions, dropping down to an altitude of just 33 feet. 3 torpedoes slammed into the battleships Conte di Cavour and Littorio. The lead Swordfish took a hit and crashed into the sea. The second wave, which launched 30 minutes later and consisted of 7 Swordfish and 2 Fulmars, also found success. Their torpedoes struck the battleship Caio Duilio and hit the Littorio again. Bombs caused serious damage to the cruiser Trento and the destroyer Libeccio. During the attack, 1 more torpedo bomber was shot down. The very next morning, Italian planes were out patrolling the sea trying to hunt down the British fleet. 3 of them got a little too close and were quickly taken out by Fulmars from 806 Squadron. Inspired by their success at Taranto, the British decided to go for another major operation called Excess. The goal was to guide transport ships from Gibraltar to unconquered Malta and move ships from the island over to Alexandria in Egypt. Unfortunately, the Fulmars from the carrier Illustrious didn't quite manage the job this time. On January 10th, when their floating airfield was attacked by a few Italian planes, the cover fighters rushed off to chase them away. But as it turned out, that was just a diversion. Right at that moment, the carrier was jumped by 40 German Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. The Fulmars still on deck scrambled quickly, but the raid was over before they could gain enough altitude to engage. The carrier took 6 bomb hits that started massive fires, and the cruiser Southampton was sent to the bottom. When 20 German Ju-87s and Bf-109s attacked again 4 hours later, the Fulmars were ready and waiting. Only 1 Stuka managed to drop its bombs, the rest were driven off, and 5 of them were shot down. The British now faced a formidable opponent, Germany's 10th Air Fleet, which had just relocated to Sicily. The situation in the Mediterranean started to turn against the British. The Illustrious was effectively out of action, and after some urgent repairs in Alexandria, she headed off to Norfolk in the United States to lick her wounds. But even under these conditions, the carrier-based Fulmars kept racking up successes. At the end of March, the Italian fleet tried to cut off British convoy routes near the island of Crete. The ship Formidable arrived to replace the damaged carrier. While escorting Swordfish torpedo bombers during an attack on the battleship Vittorio Veneto, Fulmars from her 805 squadron scored a victory over 2 Ju-88s. Aircraft from this very squadron, as well as 806 Squadron, which had been transferred from the disabled carrier, provided cover for Swordfish and Albacores during other attacks on Italian ships. The Battle of Cape Matapan, which became the largest naval battle in the Mediterranean, ended in a victory for the British. Truth be told, on May 26, 1941, Formidable received a gift in the form of a bomb weighing 2,200 pounds and also headed off for repairs. However, in the air battles, the British lost only 2 Fulmars. Fulmar aircraft from 805 Squadron were transferred to the Egyptian base at Dakila near Alexandria and were entrusted with the defense of the island of Crete. Aircraft from the Special Unit 800X flight also operated from the shore. This was the former 801 Squadron, which had previously flown Skua machines and arrived from the deck of the carrier Furious, Using the airfields of Malta, from May to October 1941, they carried out almost continuous night raids on Sicily. Fulmars fought over other seas as well. In the Atlantic, it is impossible to overestimate their contribution to the destruction of the German battleship Bismarck. For the first strike intended to slow the ship down, they deployed aircraft from the brand new carrier Victorious. On its deck, there were only 9 Swordfish torpedo bombers and 6 Fulmar fighters, with crews that hadn't even had time to complete their full training course. At 10 in the evening on May 24, 1941, in terrible weather, the first wave of torpedo bombers took off under the command of Eugene Esmond. The night attack was preceded by reconnaissance. Fulmars located the exact position of the Bismarck and then provided cover for the torpedo bombers and helped them with navigation. After covering more than 185 miles, the group reached the target, where they were met with a squall of anti-aircraft fire. However, the pilots were able to get close enough to attack. Only 1 torpedo hit the mark, striking the middle of the armored hull, so it didn't cause serious damage. The mission was a failure, and 2 Fulmars did not return to the deck. For 2 days, the British had no idea where the enemy was. It wasn't until 10:30 in the morning that a patrol Catalina spotted him, followed later by a scout Swordfish from the aircraft carrier Ark Royal. At noon on May 26th, the first wave of 14 Swordfishes took off. Because of the bad weather, they couldn't find the Bismarck and mistakenly attacked their own cruiser, the Sheffield. The second wave of 15 aircraft launched at 7 to 10 p.m., just as the weather took a turn for the worse. But this time, the search was successful. Despite heavy defensive fire, the pilots dropped 13 torpedoes, 2 of which actually hit the ship. The first struck the armored belt, and the second hit the stern area. This jammed the rudder in the extreme left position, which sealed the fate of the pride of the German fleet. In June 1941, Fulmars flying from the decks of the aircraft carriers Furious and Victorious took part in attacks on the German-occupied ports of Kirkenes and Petsamo in northern Norway. The strike by the Swordfish and Albacore bombers, escorted by the Fulmars, inflicted only minor damage on the enemy, a result that came at the heavy cost of 14 lost machines. However, the Fulmar pilots still managed to shoot down 2 Me-110s and 3 Bf-109s. In 1942, these aircraft defended the Suez Canal zone and Ceylon in the Far East, and flying from the decks of the Victorious and Formidable, they flew reconnaissance and cover missions for the Allied landings in North Africa. Even in 1943, when the role of primary carrier-based fighters was passing to the newer Seafires, the Fulmars continued to support the landings in Sicily, and in the North Sea, they guarded convoys heading to the northern ports of the Soviet Union. At the peak of their career, Fairey Fulmar aircraft were successfully flying from 8 large and 5 escort carriers. And starting in November 1941, they began launching them from the catapults of ordinary merchant ships to drive away the German long-range FW-200 Condor bombers from the naval convoys. Over the course of 2 years, from September 1940 to August 1942, Fulmar crews destroyed at least 112 enemy aircraft in aerial combat and damaged another 80. This amounted to about a third of all machines shot down by British naval aviation during that period. The Fulmar's own combat losses during this time came to 40 aircraft. The last surviving Fulmar is currently located at the Fleet Air Arm Museum at the Yeovilton base. By a lucky coincidence, it happens to be the very first prototype of the model. After trials in April 1940, it saw combat in the Mediterranean. Later on, it was brought back to Britain, upgraded to the Mark II standard, and used as a civilian courier plane at the Fairey Company all the way up until 1959. Later, the machine was returned to the Navy, restored to its original appearance, and has been on display in the museum since 1972. The Fairey Fulmar Mark I was an all-metal aircraft with a low-mounted wing, a classic tail, and landing gear that retracted in flight. The crew consisted of 2 people, a pilot and a navigator. This machine was created for a wide spectrum of tasks: fleet protection as a fighter, conducting tactical reconnaissance, shadowing enemy ships, and even carrying out bombing strikes. The wing had a sturdy structure with duralumin skin and consisted of 3 parts: a center section, which was one piece with the fuselage, and 2 outer panels. So that the airplane would take up less space on the deck, these outer wing sections could be manually folded back alongside the fuselage. The ailerons had a metal frame covered in fabric, while the landing flaps were completely metal and operated hydraulically. The body of the aircraft consisted of 2 main sections: The front part was assembled from metal tubes and covered with panels. The rear part was a rigid, semi-monocoque structure. Interestingly, the sheets of the skin were joined in a special way, creating a kind of stiffening rib, which significantly increased the strength of the fuselage. The two-seat cockpit was enclosed by a long, continuous glass canopy with sliding sections. Right behind the pilot sat the main fuel tank holding 186 gallons, along with the hydraulic fluid reservoir. On top of that, an auxiliary drop tank carrying another 71 gallons could be strapped underneath the fuselage. The tail section was all metal construction, though the control surfaces themselves were fabric covered. The vertical fin was actually offset slightly to the left. They did that specifically to counteract the torque from the engine. As for the landing gear, the main struts used hydraulics to fold inward into the wing towards the fuselage and were completely enclosed by doors. The tail wheel didn't retract. Since this was a carrier-based aircraft, it sported an arrestor hook mounted on a reinforced frame. When stowed, it tucked away neatly into a recess on the belly of the fuselage. The heart of the aircraft was the Rolls-Royce Merlin 8 power plant. This was a powerful 12-cylinder liquid-cooled V-type engine, packed very tightly under the cowling to maximize aerodynamics. At takeoff, it cranked out 1080 horsepower at 3,000 revolutions per minute. That engine drove a 3-bladed Rotol variable pitch propeller measuring 11.5 feet in diameter. Here is an interesting detail. The twin exhaust stacks were tuned to generate a little bit of extra jet thrust. The engine was fired up using a Kaufman cartridge starter. Basically, it used a special charge to kick the engine over. By the way, the Fulmar was one of the first aircraft to feature this system as standard equipment. The cooling radiators were positioned underneath the engine, forming a chin duct that also housed the air intake for the carburetor. The Fulmar Mark II model could be distinguished by two separate air intakes. They installed large dust filters inside them, which allowed for trouble-free flying in the hot tropics. Also, some machines used for night operations were fitted with special glare shields to keep the flames from the exhaust pipes from blinding the pilot in the dark. The main fuel supply was located in the fuselage, and the oil tank sat right behind the engine. The machine ran on high-octane aviation gasoline. Now, about the weapons. The wings held 8 Browning machine guns, caliber .303. The ammo load was solid, 750 rounds per gun in belts. The outboard guns sat a little higher than the others. On some planes, they also rigged up a Vickers K machine gun of the same caliber in the navigator's cockpit on a folding mount. But it wasn't of much use. Firing it was incredibly difficult, and the field of fire was absolutely tiny. Under the wings, you could hang 8 bombs weighing 100 pounds each. And in the body behind the wings, there was also a concealed chute for launching flares.